So hi everyone, thank you very much for joining us today on our talk on Australian-China relations. We have our panelists here with us, the Director of Australian Centre in China in the World, Jiang Golly, and also we have a Director of, it was China Policies, wasn't it?
And I edited the China Story blog.
And the editor of
Everyone
China Story
should
blog.
go and have a look.
Yes, so yeah, everyone please follow that. That'll be really great. And today they will be just talking about a lot of different aspects of the Chinese-Australian relationship and different questions that really have come up throughout the entire process. A few points of housekeeping. So you can submit your questions for the panelists on for the forum. It's on the Q&A on the bottom of the Zoom tab, and you can also upvote questions that you would like to see. Please be respectful at all times, as we can see. And also there's a short poll for those who are interested, which you can also find at the bottom of the Zoom screen. If you wish to talk and ask your question directly to the panelists, you would have to send me a message with your question and with that you want to ask and your name, and I will allow you to talk to the panelists directly. And last of all, thank you for coming, and let's have a great webinar. All right, Jane, so I think we should get started on what you currently see as the current state of Australian-Chinese relations.
Sure, thanks Bobby, and thanks everyone for joining us. I wish we could see you, but I guess at least you can see us. I will just start by noting that the poll results that's at the start of it, that 23% of people in the room have said that Australia-China relations will improve in the next, was it 5 to 10 years? 38% said it would deteriorate, and 38% said they don't know. Always good to sit on the fence on these things, although I'm going to predict that the numbers might shift towards a deterioration by the time you've heard us speaking today, and I'm sorry if that's a depressing starting point, but I hope we also have some time to explore some of the positives. But there is no question that the Australia-China relationship is at its lowest point, I think, since we recognised the People's Republic of China a very, very long time ago, about as long ago as I was born. We can talk later on about all the sorts of things that have contributed to that, and they happened, it started long before COVID. I'd probably trace it back to about 2016, but with a really big shift, I think, from about 2018 onwards, that connects in some ways to the way that China has transitioned or become under Xi Jinping. There's a lot of things that have happened internally and also in how China engages with the world that I guess people weren't hoping for or expecting would happen some 5 years earlier. So I guess I'd put it simply as quite an about turn in terms of a path towards something that was never going to look like a liberal democracy. There was a lot of people, I think, wishfully thinking that that might happen. And it was around 2018 that people started to wake up and realise it wasn't going to happen. And that's made a lot of people in Australia and across the world uncomfortable. But I also want to start the discussion today by bringing the United States straight into the picture. And we'll all have different views on that. I don't know where the people are from who are listening to us today, but it's not like all Australians have a united front or view on how important the United States is, on what Donald Trump's been doing in the last several years, although in general there's not a lot of support for that. But where I thought I'd kick things off, and I am going to take a little bit of time to put this in the US context, and then we can spend the most of the time speaking about Australia-China relations, but you can't separate that from Sino-US relations and Australia-US relations as well. And that came to the forefront just this week. I don't know how many people, and I'd be interested if you want to let us know how many of you have seen the press remarks that were released by Mike Pompeo, the US Secretary of State, following his meeting with Foreign Minister Maurice Payne, our Foreign Minister, and Defence Minister Linda Reynolds on Tuesday at the AUSMIN, the Australian-US Ministerial Consultations. And there's some really interesting stuff in there that I think lays the groundwork for our discussion. So let me just make maybe a couple of points about, first of all, what Pompeo had to say. He is an absolute hardliner on China and is now quite openly using terms like containment and hold China down. He has called for the Chinese Communist Party to be brought to an end. So it's a very dramatic position for a Secretary of State in another country to make. At these talks that were released, and again, I'll just try and give a summary, apologies to those who are already familiar with this, but he basically starts by saying, you know, today we've talked at length about the Chinese Communist malign activity in the Indo-Pacific region and around the world. He then goes on to commend, and this gives you a bit of a flavour for why, from China's perspective, certainly things have gone pretty badly this year when they look at how the Australian government has reacted to them. Pompeo says the United States commends the Morrison government for standing up for democratic values and the rule of law, you know, for despite continued coercive pressure from the Chinese Communist Party. The US also commends Australia for publicly condemning China's disinformation campaign and insisting on an independent review, which of course was the cause of a whole bunch of discussions earlier in the year. And we talked about that at the last webinar, but we can pick up more on that. I would note, you know, and again, you'll get a sense, I'm going to pick on both sides here. I'm not siding with China. I'm not necessarily siding with Australia. I'm pro-Australian. I'm interested and want our national interests to be protected. But I also happen to be privileged to live in a country where I can sort of suggest when I think our government might be getting things a little bit wrong, and also how they might do it better. That's part of my sort of privilege and duty as an academic. And so I will slip in there. Interesting that we talk, and the Australian government has pushed ahead to develop some mechanisms to deal with what they call the disinformation of both China and Russia. Somehow the United States doesn't get a mention, even though, of course, they're now sitting on, I think, 4.5 million COVID cases, where their own president lied to the people and told them, among other things, that they should drink disinfectant, and that's caused multiple deaths in the country. So, you know, if you're going to criticise disinformation, I think you should do it everywhere. In any case, what else has Australia done right as far as the United States thinks? They've applauded our efforts to include Taiwan in the World Health Assembly because that's a vigorous democracy filled with wisdom. We've reaffirmed our collective commitment to being resilient against future pandemics and CCP retaliation. They're pretty pleased with what we've done on Hong Kong, both of our nations denouncing the CCP's violation of its treaties. And the US has applauded Australia's decisive response to suspend its extradition agreement and give visas to rest, for being at the front line of standing up to Huawei and ZTE, and basically to pushing back on what they call the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party's attempt to dominate technology space. And another slightly hypocritical one, if you ask me, is that they're thanking us for pushing ahead and laying down the law on the South China Seas. Australia has asserted and submitted a document to the United Nations saying what China's doing wrong. But I would note that the United States isn't even signed up for UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas. And so it seems that one country is allowed to break the rules, but the other one isn't. I'll try and keep this brief. I just want to give a sense of what Foreign Minister Payne said in response to this. There's a lot of talk about values and how our values with the United States align. I think this is pretty problematic, actually. I'd rather that we were thinking about universal values. Yes, we're a democracy and China isn't, but we're all individuals, and we have human rights that are laid out in a United Nations Human Rights Charter that I think we'd do better to talk more about. Australia, on Foreign Minister Payne's comments, said that, yes, some countries have used the pandemic to undermine liberal democracy. She stresses the importance of multilateral institutions, which is an interesting statement to make to the US as they've pulled out of the WHO and are decimating the World Trade Organization as well. They also then she talks about how we need to support our mates, literally, further afield, using the US-Australia alliance to deepen our friendship with others, including the Five Eyes, ASEAN, the Quad, the East Asia Summit, all importantly not including China. We'll build new groupings, cementing friendships that improve our security through a network of nations that share our vision of an open, prosperous and secure Indo-Pacific. Now, if you read the press about this week, there are some pretty different takes on it. One is that it looks like we're just lining up exactly like the United States. In some parts, it looks like we're going ahead of them on pushing back on China. One key difference is that where Pompeo, through his speech, mentioned China, I think, at least 9 times and described how malign and evil they were. And Marise Payne was very careful not to do that. She only mentioned China once. But of course, every one of those points that I've made there was implicitly about China. So it's a little bit curious that then in the question time, she concludes by saying, well, making a point that the relationship we have with China is very important and we have no intention of injuring it. Now, that's my way of kicking off the conversation. No intention of injuring it, and yet pushing back on all of those things that we know deeply, deeply upset Beijing. They certainly see it as injurious. And the question is, what happens next when that is the sort of situation or the circumstance that we find ourselves in? So that's my starting point.
All right, well, I agree with Jiang that Australia-China relationship is probably at its lowest point for a very, very long time. I will talk a little bit about basically from perspective of different countries. So one, from China is becoming more and more assertive, and that's perhaps why its relations with countries around the world, as well as neighbors, is getting a little bit more tense. But from China's perspective, Australia is now firmly in the camp of the United States. So previously, what China usually do when it is coming up against the United States, what it often does is, it tries to improve its relationship with allies of the United States, to basically trying to, pick them apart, perhaps. But now that it appears that China considers Australia to be firmly in the camp with the United States, that our interests are so closely aligned that there is really no point in improving relationship with Australia anymore. From Australia's perspective, our national interest is different from the United States. But one of the biggest important part of our national interest is our alliance with the United States. And perhaps that's why in a lot of matters, from outside perspective, it looks like we are following the United States footsteps. Now, the problem is that, of course, that the United States and China is having an even deteriorating relationship as well. That could be for a few different reasons. And one is the upcoming election. It appears that the Trump strategy is basically to bash China as one of its election strategies. It's now talking about alliance of democracies in a very important Pompeo speech, a different one from the Jiang was referring to. And the alliance of democracies, and of course, it will call up on countries like Australia to basically go along with the United States in, countering influence of China around the world. But I think it's also important to remember that relationship is more than just politics as well. For Australia, we still at the moment have a very strong trade and economic relationship with China. And of course, we have very strong people-to-people links, and that is from Chinese students coming here, Australian students going overseas, which unfortunately is being disrupted right now, and migration patterns. So yes, it is deteriorating relationship, and the outlook unfortunately does not look very good in politics, but I guess for one sliver of optimism, I hope that our other trade and people links will remain strong.
Yeah, and let's look forward to talking about that at the end of it, because I think it'll be nice to try and finish on a bright note.
Yeah, I agree. So I think let's start off with some questions from the audience, actually. So currently we hear a lot of questions about tensions between China and the West in recent times and how their relationship are deteriorating. So are there any countries that have actually gotten closer to China at the same time, or actually the impact of their relationship has become more important? For example, we can see, like, for example, India, Chinese relations have really deteriorated as a result, and we can throw that into the mix. What do you think are the significant players in this field right now?
Well, okay, I'll have a go. That is a big, hard question covering a lot of different countries, and I'm, mainly thinking about the US and Australia at the moment, so I'm not that well placed to answer it well. But I'd say the overall trend almost across the world is that countries are feeling less friendly towards China than they were, say, 5 years ago, and that is because of things like Hong Kong and Xinjiang and the way that Xi Jinping, has taken the country. Not that it's all bad, I don't think. There's still pretty strong economic growth stories, for example, compared with the rest of the world. I think they've handled the COVID pandemic, much better than other countries, and this starts to open up questions about, whether and how authoritarian states can sometimes do some things better. And that leads me to think, if you look across the world, there are trends in all continents of certain countries becoming more authoritarian, not less. So the Russians, the Hungarians, the Turkish. I'm not going to pick my South American country because I might get it wrong, but, those countries perhaps have aligned more closely with China in recent times. Obviously, India's not a good example. Currently, tensions high there because of those border clashes. And also, India's absolutely swept up in the US-China battle, for lack of a better word, because, it's seen and presented as a like-minded democracy, which is a very curious thing to me. If you actually look at how Indian democracy works, it's you wouldn't want it to be too like-minded with our own. So in any case, I'm not really. It's a tough question to answer. You and I might ask you: Are there any countries that you can think of that are more friendly with China now than they were 5 years ago? Possibly in the Pacific, possibly some in Africa. Not sure about that.
Also Iran, possibly also Russia. So when in Pompeo's speech he talks about alliance of democracies against authoritarian country or against communist country, he used communism more as a scare quote, I guess, because it is quite scary in the United States for some reason. But then he says, we should be allied with Vietnam, which is also a communist country. So clearly it's not it's not very clear that which side who is out, and I think most countries do not want to be forced to choose between China and the United States. ASEAN countries, for example, Singapore, I don't think they want to say, okay, I'm aligned with one or the other. But in terms of which countries are perhaps more, the relationship goes up and down. There were a few times when Japan and Korea had very, very tense relationship with China before, and now it seems to be not so much. So it depends on, I guess, where you compare to. But overall, it appears that perhaps there are countries like Iran, Russia, even though they have different interests, they also have a little bit similar interests. Maybe countries in Central Africa, in Pacific, and some countries in Africa probably are perhaps more closer to China.
I can also see one of the panelists adding a few lists there, one of the participants, Cambodia, New Zealand, Fiji. I don't think New Zealand has improved, but it certainly hasn't deteriorated as much as ours have. And yes, there's lots going on in the Pacific, where through the Belt and Road and other means, you could say China's trying to buy influence. You could say they're trying to help the countries develop. That's a big set of discussions that opens up and links back to this question of what a rising or risen power does. power essentially is the same as influence, but wealth is the way that people achieve it. And through spending, in various, particularly poor parts of the world, China is likely to see warming relations. Kazakhstan's an example that I know a couple of years ago was looking pretty good on that front because the Belt and Road money was flowing in. But I also know that there was subsequently pushback to that, with the people starting to be concerned, whether it was about possibly labour issues or environmental issues, that, maybe the Belt and Road projects weren't all getting perfectly right. So as Ewan said, what the people think, what the government thinks don't often align within countries, and they're all changing quite quickly over time, particularly, in the wake of COVID.
Yeah, okay. So the question really was, how much do China really need Australia, especially with kind of falling iron exports from Brazil? There's this consensus, like China really needs Australian food, needs Australian ore, needs Australian exports. Like, how much do you think that is true?
Yeah, we got it. Yun, do you want to have a go, Yun?
It depends on the sector. So yes, for its own development, in terms of, like, for example, coal and iron ore, I think China does need Australia, because Australia is one of the biggest producers of these minerals, and there is very little other competitions out there. And if China wants to, take those resources, then it will need Australia. Of course, there are a few things that China can do to reduce its reliance on Australia. And one of them is, for example, if it were to develop alternative energy sources, it could do that. In terms of agriculture and food, it has more choices. So it relies less on Australia. So it can import from, say, Brazil or the United States or even Russia for, beef, soybeans. So it's all depends on what sector. So one, it depends on the sector and whether Australia is important player in that sector. And two, the second factor is how important is that sector to China's development.
And so I'll give another example, the education sector. We talk about how reliant we are on Chinese students. And if there are some of you listening in today, thanks for being here and helping support our economy. And I hope you have a wonderful learning experience while you're here. But the other question that is relevant is what other substitutes there are for Australian services or goods. So think about education. Most Chinese students, if they're travelling overseas, want to travel to English-speaking countries. Not all of them, but most. And so the top 5 countries, or is it going to be 4, are the US, the UK, Australia, and Canada. And New Zealand's a much smaller player. Now that means that can the Chinese students choose not to come here? I mean, a lot of them want to go to the US in the first place, but this is where you've got to understand more about global change, because as the United States tightens up, and they are doing that on Chinese student visas, on a whole bunch of things, the whole American rhetoric is really quite clearly anti-China. And so surely lots of Chinese students might think they don't want to go there, they want to come here instead. And that could create a boom in our sector, unless we, for some reason, stopped making them feel welcome as well. And of course, I hope that that's not the case, but policy around the edges really affects things. I mean, the iron ore one and coal are quite interesting ones. There's actually a really good article on the China Story website, thechinastory.org, that Ed and Yun and I are co-editors of, talking about not how, well, the Chinese basically starting to think about where alternative supplies are, and that could affect us. But another big thing that could affect us is that the Americans could start to pressure the Australians to not sell to China, because iron ore and coal are, used to produce steel and ships. And if this came to military conflict, that means we're supplying the enemy with goods that we shouldn't, or that the Americans don't want us to. So I had a wonderful thought last night, because I like a little bit of irony in the mix, that imagine if the US under Trump pushed us not to sell coal, iron ore to China. One, would we listen? But if we did, because the coal and the mining industry would collapse, as Yun said, you might then see a surge in green and renewable energies, and the policy outcome would be a greener environment, which is at least one silver lining, but also definitely not what our current government is intent on achieving. So I think that'd be kind of nice.
I certainly that'd be great. And just on a question that I think hasn't really been discussed recently, which is, what does the Belt and Road Initiative look like in a post-COVID world? Is it still viable? With the global pandemic and things like that, that kind of change in trust towards China, even amongst developing countries, is that going to have an impact on the Belt and Road? Or, is the economic effect from the damages of COVID going to take precedent as people are more desperate to seek funding from potential Belt and Road Initiative projects to kind of develop their post-COVID economies?
Yeah, great question, Bobby. I think and write about the Belt and Road a little bit. And I think you've got to try and, so first of all, we know that the Chinese economy has slowed massively. I mean, they had minus 6.9% growth in the first quarter. They're already in the positives for the second quarter, and people are, all sorts of predictions out there, but some people I trust, and my own assessment is that it might grow between, say, 2 and 3% this year. Of course, all sorts of things can go wrong from now, and we don't know what would happen, for example, if they had to have another lockdown, depending on how, if they can continue to control COVID. But that makes them growing faster than just about any other economy in the world. And they also happen to be the economy with the most capital to sell or to ship overseas or to invest overseas. They have a capital surplus, and countries, including Australia and most other Western economies, and the developing world, are in need of capital. So there will be a reduced pool of capital coming out of China because the economies crumble, because they need to invest more internally at home. But still, it's the best place to get capital from, because no other countries almost, I mean, the Japanese have got a little bit of capital, the Germans have a little bit of capital, but the Chinese are the big capital surplus holders. So, when times are tough economically across the globe, you'd think if economics growth, development's your top priority, then you continue to want to attract Chinese investment. And I personally think that's a good idea. What you want to spend money on at home is making sure that those investments are well utilised, that they don't result in damage to the environment or the poor treatment of labour. But certainly pushing out the Chinese money because you don't trust it, well, think through what that means. And I talk about this in the Australian context. And you hear a lot of Australians saying, we don't want Chinese capital, there's too much Chinese investment, they own too much of our land. Well, if that money doesn't come from China, no one has the capital to invest in Australia. We all spend too much. We don't have net savings to pour in. And so the only thing that can happen there is that our job rate falls and that people become unemployed. And I don't think that's a great idea.
People tend to change their mind about investment from China once they actually want to sell things.
Yeah, yeah.
In terms of BRI, I guess another thing that people tend to think about welcoming, foreign investment or investment from China is the reputation effect from COVID. And I think from that, I don't think, despite what the American, the US administration is trying to get everyone to blame COVID onto China, I think most countries are not really buying that. So I don't think that because of that fact that COVID originated in Wuhan, that countries will stop cooperating with China just because of that. So I don't think that's the case. But there could be some fallout, for example, that we've seen recently. There were some racist attacks in Guangzhou against people from African origins, and that could then contribute to, I guess, people are not as friendly towards China as a country, or Chinese investment, or even Chinese people who live in Africa. So that could potentially have some effect on BRI.
That's great. And actually, we have a question from Ayrton from the audience around Canberra's recent defense upgrades, and maybe talk a little bit about what you see as the motivations behind that defense upgrade. is it trying for Australia to become more militarily independent from the US? What has really driven that decision, do you guys think?
Oh, that's another big question. If I was the, can I say, benevolent dictator of this country, which I'm not, and I don't want to be, but I don't think I'd be choosing to spend more on defence at this moment. I've got a lot of other things that I'd want to be spending it on, including greening up the environment and making sure that people weren't living on the streets. So, I guess that reveals a little bit about my political leanings. I'm also a pacifist, though, and I absolutely don't want a country to go to war or to be in a war. And if we are, or if we did, unfortunately, find ourselves in that position or lead ourselves into that position, then you need to have a strong defence force. And I think this latest increase in spending, has some merit based in the idea that America is declining, that their presence in the Asia-Pacific region is declining. The Australians are not comfortable with that, and having some more capacity to defend ourselves against an enemy makes sense in some kind of framework. But I'd then ask the question, well, how do you make sure you don't have those enemies? And if you think that enemy is going to be China, a military battle with the world's second largest or largest economy that has just so much more military capacity than we do seems like a battle that we're going to lose. And more importantly, I don't think we are going to end up, I'm not going to put a probability on the, of armed or military conflict happening, but it comes back to one of the questions that we posed for this session. It's, if we're in a Cold War, and I think we are, or what I'd call a geoeconomic war, it's a war that's being played out using economic tools, using sanctions and coercion and tariffs and trade wars, and all the sorts of things that we've been reading about in the press. The Chinese government, warning students that Australia is not a safe place to travel, playing an economic card that would reduce and cause damage to the Australian university sector. If you're in a geoeconomic war, and that's, again, just to be clear on how I define that, simply as the use of economic tools to achieve these non-economic outcomes. For the Americans, using sanctions and technology blocks to try and preserve its technological primacy in the world. For China, using tariffs or increasing tariffs or closing exports from the beef abattoirs to send signals to us that they're not happy about other things that we're done. If that's the war that we're in, and I think unfortunately it is, then spending money on the military doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I mean, I'm biased because I'm an economist, but spending money on resilience, on being able to prevent coercion, making sure you don't go around doing coercing yourself, making sure you tell the Americans as well as the Chinese that you don't think breaking the rules of the international order are a really good idea. There's a lot of other things I'd be spending money on first. But, we all have our biases, and I'm not the one having to grapple in the government about all sorts of national security concerns that I don't have any information on because I don't have that kind of security clearance.
Well, the defense spending has been justified on the basis of we are living in a more dangerous world, and that is probably true. But if the defense spending was to be more independent from the United States, to deter attacks from China, I doubt that any spending from Australia could really achieve that result. Overall, even if we ramp up defense spending, there's no way we can fight China on our own. Even if we do ally with New Zealand or some other countries in the region, it's probably still going to fall short. So I don't think we're pursuing an independent defense that is not living under the United States nuclear deterrence umbrella. We still very much rely on the United States for our defense. Now, one interesting thing we've seen recently is that although we are ramping up defense spending, it appears that the government is cutting diplomacy budget, which is not what you would expect if we were living in a more dangerous world. So I think perhaps it's true that, where there are threats from overseas, then we should spend more money in trying to understand them, trying to communicate in spending more money on diplomacy, perhaps.
Oh, what a great addition, Ewan. I totally agree with that. And, you know, I'll confess maybe 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, I didn't really understand or value diplomacy as much as I do today. And it's partly having become a student, I'll say, of international relations, of economic statecraft or this geoeconomics, but that sits alongside diplomacy and military statecraft. And you need to think about which one of those is the most appropriate for the times that you live in. And Yun and I are both definitely agreeing there that, you know, why we're seeing cuts to the diplomatic corps and to diplomacy in general. I mean, and on top of that, the aid budget, you know, something else that's in the news today, just how appalling it is really that the Western countries have all, you know, bunkered down. Yes, we've got our own crises to deal with, but you know, there are hundreds of millions of people still starving in the world, and we're letting go of that, and that can cause conflict and strife over there, and that makes the world a more unstable place in the future. Really tough questions for the government to grapple with. And again, you know, I'm not telling them what they should do. I guess I just try and think through what I would do, because that's, you know, can be quite fun sometimes and also good for your brain.
Definitely. And I think, you know, the more options a country have, the better it is. But just on the issue of diplomacy, obviously what's been really prevalent in the news recently is the closing down of embassies in the US and in China. So we're just hoping to talk a little bit about, you know, what are the motivations driving these closing down of the embassy? Like, what did it serve to limit your diplomacy options? And is it a trend for future deteriorations to come?
Yun.
Yes. Tit for tat embassy closures. So before we had people kicking out journalists, now we have people kicking out diplomats. So the United States perhaps was the one that took the first shot as such by giving Houston consulate 72 hours basically to vacate. The reason they gave was that the consulate was at the center of intelligence collection, which is probably true because all embassies and consulates are there to collect intelligence. That is what they're for. Sometimes they have undeclared intelligence officers, which of course is not really great for the receiving country, the home country that the embassy is based, but that's how things are in the international world, and every country, almost every country does it. So it is a very strange reason to close the embassy. Houston also have a very big Chinese American community. So it's not great for people there. Of course, then what happened is China closed the US Chengdu embassy, which is what we expect because we expect that China usually does these kinds of things tit for tat, just like with the journalists, kicking out journalists, you kick one of us out, we kick one of you out. It appears why would the United States try to kick out Chinese diplomats? It seems to be just doing it purely for the reason of escalating tension. I really can't think, I'm struggling to think of another reason. It appears to be just one of the ways to basically bash China. That week has been pretty full on in terms of China-US relationship, you know, that we had Pompeo speech and now they're closing embassies. It seems just to be one of the ways that they're doing to ramp up tension with China.
You know, and it is one way. I agree with that. There are lots of other ways that you could go with that. Although they did, of course, say with the embassy closure, Ewan, that it was to do with, you know, suspicions of espionage. I mean, of course, all embassies in the world, part of their job is to collect intelligence. So but I understand, you know, there are quite different levels of espionage, and maybe some are more unacceptable than others.
But what happens with espionage is the normal way is to declare someone persona non grata and basically kick them out. So they usually kick out individual people who they suspect to be intelligence officers instead of closing entire consulates. That's quite unprecedented.
Yeah. I mean, can I just add to that, Bobby? You know, thinking about this question of what a Cold War might look like or what a geoeconomic war might look like, I think it's really worth thinking about, and again, I'm not an expert in this area, I'm just kind of thinking out loud, and I have been for a while, about, with such a globally integrated economy, when the Australian and Chinese economies are so reliant and dependent on each other, when the Americans and the Chinese also, it's not that long ago that we sort of called them Chimerica to talk about just how integrated they are. And as relationships deteriorate into what I will note, more and more people, I started suggesting that we were headed for a Cold War at least a year, if not 2 years ago, and people would say, oh, don't be silly, that's not going to happen. Now people are talking about it as though it's a matter of fact. But where does that lead to? At what point, and I'm asking these questions, I don't have the answers, but at what point, when you have an adversary, do you say, we're not going to sell our iron ore to you because we don't want you to use that to build ships, or we're not going to trade, we're not going to have your students here and you're not going to be allowed to travel there. And, where does that lead in terms of the people to people and business links that we have? We don't have a lot of experience in dealing with this. You'd have to go back to World War II, when that integration was so much lower that it was easier to, for example, following that sort of block the Soviet Union countries out. That's not going to be either easy or optimal for jobs, for people, I don't think, in the future that we're possibly facing. And I'd be doing everything we could to make sure that we didn't get into that future.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, we have a very quick question about why China chose to close the consulate in Chengdu specifically. And I think maybe Yun can answer this, because you said at the start, it was obviously going to be Chengdu.
Oh, no, I didn't say it was obviously going to be Chengdu. It was going to be one consulate. One of the reasons is that Chengdu is in the west. I think the consulate is responsible for Tibet regions and maybe also possibly Xinjiang region, I'm not sure. So maybe it's because the area it covers is quite sensitive. That could be one of the reasons. Yeah, I'm not really sure why they chose Chengdu.
I read something about, they could have chosen Wuhan, the consulate there, but, after COVID, like, it's not really in effect anymore. So
yeah, that's right. The Wuhan ones basically, they weren't really operating.
Yeah, so that was like the natural choice to go with. And yeah.
Bobby,
yeah.
Can I just come back? I just noticing that one of the participants, Michael Riley, was put in the first question, and I think it links into this a little bit. And I want to open up that conversation. It's about why do we expect China to conform to Western values, and what do we have? How can we say that our system is morally superior? And my quick response to that is we can't. And you can look at a couple of examples to see that. COVID, that we're in an ideological war as well, if you want to call it that, or I'll try and tone that down. But there is an ideological struggle about, authoritarian versus democracies. Both of them can produce disinformation. Both of them can and have buggered up certain parts of the COVID, the inquiry at the start of it in China's case, the handling of it in the US and a lot of other European countries as well. So I think there's a real, there is this sort of superiority that governs our focus on values that are somehow belong to the West, even though they're crushing them a lot of the time themselves. And the example I'd give about that in this context is, it is ironic that the US is becoming more like China in the ways that it's standing up to China and standing up to what it's accused China of. And the example that I always give here is that, Trump starts the trade war and demands literally to Xi Jinping in person that China buys more barley, let's say, but wheat, agricultural goods from the US, and beef. And the Chinese say, all right, we'll do that. I think beef alone, they committed to buying $3 billion more beef from the Americans. So how does Trump think and expect Xi's going to do that? He wants him to go and order state-owned enterprises and private enterprises, if he can, to buy more goods from America. So he's basically accused China of having a system that uses state control, but then demands that they use that state control to buy more beef. And then the Chinese turn around to us, and after we've done something they're not happy with whether it was the COVID inquiry or something else along this awful trend this year, the Chinese government turns around and says, well, we're not going to buy beef from your mates, the Australians. And we stand up in arms and say, God, aren't they behaving badly? But who started that? And how similar has the United States really been in that trade war? They did start it, not groundlessly. The Chinese economic system deserves to be under scrutiny for the ways that it hasn't complied with the global rules, but America's does as well. So, Western values, Chinese values, I wish we could just talk about human values and also recognise our own hopelessnesses when they appear. And I will slip in there on human rights because I can't resist. But, yes, I don't like what's happening in Xinjiang one little bit. I also don't like what's happening in Indigenous Australia or on Manus Island.
I do want to talk a little bit about values. So I think the terminology is not very clear. When people say Western values, what do they actually mean, and how is a Western? So when people talk about values, Western values, that's, that apparently we're all subscribed to, they usually talk about things like freedom, democracy, so things that associate with liberal democracies. But are they actually Western though? I think to really describe as a Western value is probably not exactly quite accurate. And I like those values. I like freedom, I like democracy, and I think that they are universal values. And indeed, in places like, for example, in Republic China and People's Republic China, they do talk about 民主, which translates to democracy. Now, there are all sorts of issues with translation, direct translation like this, whether democracy in China is democracy in the West, are they same or not? But certainly they also think that democracy is an important value. And even if you look at past, in ancient Chinese texts, people will say, oh, Confucianism, that's all about deference to authority. But if you then read about Mencius, which is a very, very important text in Confucianism, it talks about democracy as well. So I think it is perhaps, I mean, you could write an entire thesis on it, I'm sure. So people perhaps need to be a bit more clear about their terminologies and what exactly they mean when they talk about values.
I love to add in the one, equality. We often hear our government talking about equality, and somehow that's put up as one of our values. The Chinese Communist Party, of course, talk about equality as one of their values. You can't be a communist or a socialist government and not, but both countries do a pretty bad job of it. It's another one where it's not a value that belongs to one country or another. They both claim it and they're both doing badly. So there's lots of different examples around like that, I think. But I'll also agree with you, and of course, especially on freedom, on academic freedom, the fact that I can sit here today, and aim with respect to challenge some of the things that I see come out of Australia, out of the Australian government, in the press. I can say whatever I like. And that is something that I just cannot put a value on because I've never had it taken away from me.
That's great. And just to move on to something that's more specific, we have a question from Nicole from the audience. Is what are your thoughts on TikTok and actually countries around the world wanting to ban it? Like, why in particular has TikTok been singled out? You would think that it would be something like WeChat that actually, people use to communicate on a daily basis, rather than just maybe, the idea of teenagers making videos of themselves dancing.
Yeah, because it's annoying. And that's all I'm saying. I'm too old for TikTok, so I'll give this one to
maybe you. Yeah.
I did write about TikTok quite a few times already, so yes, I can talk about TikTok. I have never used TikTok myself, but I've spoken to young people about TikTok, so that's my research. Why TikTok and not WeChat? Well, because WeChat is used mainly by people in the diaspora, Chinese diaspora communities, or people who actually do business or have a connection to China, whereas TikTok has a more widespread appeal. You have people who doesn't really have anything to do with China, and now they're using a Chinese-owned app, which is quite a different from, I guess, quite different from what people are used to. TikTok has a widespread appeal. That's why people are more concerned about TikTok than WeChat. But of course, there are also concerns about WeChat as well. So, sorry, what was the question?
Why TikTok? And, you know, is it a case that the Western countries don't want the East to have their data? Like, what's the motivation?
So there are a few concerns with TikTok. One is data and privacy concerns. So TikTok is owned by ByteDance, which is a Chinese company, which also owns Douyin, which is the Chinese version of TikTok. But their separation, their operation is quite separate. TikTok is strictly for foreign, and Douyin is strictly for domestic, now also in Hong Kong as well. But even though there are quite strict separation of operation, there are still concerns that ByteDance can pass information from TikTok to the Chinese government upon request. So that is a concern with data privacies, because, you know, apps usually request a lot of permissions from you, and not just TikTok. Any social media apps do that. The second concern is about propaganda use. So there are concerns that, and censorship. So there were past cases where people were talking about Xinjiang on TikTok, and those videos were taken down. So that could be used for censorship purposes. And also there are concerns that, for example, if there was an election somewhere and the Chinese government maybe favors a candidate, they could direct TikTok to show videos that's more favorable to one candidate. So that's a concern with election interference. So those are all the concerns that can be applicable to any social media apps, not just TikTok. But why people are more concerned about TikTok, it's because it's owned by China, and the company could be subject to Chinese government pressure.
Great answer.
Great, yeah. And I think we have a question from Jason from the audience. Is, you know, as Chinese diaspora and people, there's a lot of Chinese living abroad, as tensions with China escalate, what do you think, you know, what pressures would those Chinese citizens and Chinese diaspora living abroad actually face, looking at international students, people on working visas, things like that? And what do you think the governments would ask for them? And, you know, it wasn't that long ago when the US and actually Australia put Japanese people in internment camps. And that was only what, you know, like 50 something years ago. So what do you think about that?
Yeah.
You're the person for this.
So I didn't know until recently that Australia government put Japanese people in and German people in internment camps. Yeah, I only found out quite recently, so I was very shocked myself. Of course, it was a more well-known that the United States did that as well. There will be consequences probably with tensions with China escalate. We're already seeing them. So apart from all the covert racist related attacks, what we're looking at is suspicions of Chinese people from Chinese people, so that, you know, if there's a Chinese researchers, especially in STEM fields, people going to be suspicious whether they're stealing technologies. We're seeing that in Australia and the United States. And there's also suspicion of Chinese people who are involved in politics. I'm talking about Chinese Australians involved in politics. There's always insinuations about people, whether they are connected with the United Front, whether they are a stooge of the Chinese Communist Party, purely because of the views they have taken. So it appears that there's a heightened suspicion of the Chinese diaspora, whether it is Chinese students or Chinese Australians in Australia. There's very likely that they will be pressured to pick a side. So normally, you know, if you were, say, a UK English person in Australia, people will not be asking you, oh, pick a side. Do you want to, you are either English or you are Australian? That's not usually how people say that. But with the escalating rhetorics and the tensions between the two countries, unfortunately, it appears that the Chinese diaspora and being told to pick a side. That if they say anything pro-engagement, they could be, other people accuse them of being on the side of China, and people will be questioning their loyalties. Those are the things that, unfortunately, is already happening.
But as the clock starts to tick, I'm getting pretty close to the closing, Bobby, we wanted to end on a positive note, and I'm just looking through the names of the people who are here, and actually, as Yun said at the start of this, and as our final question says, you know, what can we do? What's the silver lining in anything here, and what can be done to make the world a better place, essentially? And you know, one thing I would say is in the chat room today, we've had questions from people with all sorts of different names. I'm not going to pick where all of them come from, but I can obviously see quite a few Chinese names, and then some what I might call Anglo names. There are some that I can't quite pick from all over the world, but the best thing that you can do is get out and see the world when you're allowed to. And if you can't see it out there at the moment, you've got people sitting in this room, or, you know, hopefully or definitely on campus, where you just get to know people from different cultures, and, you know, that shared experience of figuring out that you're all humans. I mean, I've got friends all over the world, not millions, but one of my very best friends is Chinese, and I met him in a bar in China some 20 years ago now. I turn up in Beijing every year or so and just call him when I get there and say hello, and off we go. You know, and we come from very different worlds, but friendship really is one of the best ways that we've got, I think, to take this forward in a way where the people do have power to say, well, just a second, he's my mate and he's Chinese, and, you know, who cares about that? Isn't that lovely?
Yep, building personal relationships. And I want to say that you know, politics and things like that, nuance is not a dirty word. I think it is good to be nuanced. It's good to actually investigate claims in the media as well, and see and test them, be critical of everything you see and hear.
Yeah. And I think, you know, as we're bringing closing time, so, you know, how do we make sure that the people-to-people links are strong and positive, you know, when high-end politics looks so ugly and depressing? And, you know, what are your advice for people wanting to improve Australian-Chinese relations?
Yeah, so other than getting out and making sure you meet people who come from different places, whichever side you might be on, learning to speak the language. You know, the Chinese students come here and do a fantastic job. I'm just always in awe of anyone who writes, you know, whether it's an undergraduate essay or a master's essay, let alone a PhD in a foreign tongue, is just, you know, such an amazing achievement. And Australians aren't particularly good at that, but learning to speak another language is one really good way of cementing links, because you can't really understand people, I don't think, very well until there's a common ground. And luckily English seems to be that, but learning Chinese is still very, very high up on the list to me. I mean, and then of course, not just, you know, hanging out on campus, but I guess what that can lead to down the track for entrepreneurial people. I'm clearly not one, but I'm sure you're out there. You know, it's the business and trading links that actually do continue to look pretty good at the moment. That doesn't mean they will in the future. But even though, and I made this point last time, I think, so apologies if you've heard it before, but I've got a fabulous PhD student looking at this relationship between, you know, what happens when political relations deteriorate between China and the US, China and Australia, Korea, Japan and India are in the mix. And what he's shown, doing some really clever stuff, is that basically the trade stays pretty resilient. You know, so actually, and we hear this from the business community all the time. I'm on the Australia-China Business Council in the ACT, and everyone there is coming together and saying, well, actually, the trading's still going pretty well. You know, we're worried about government policy, but it's not stopping us. So, you know, people to people first, actually on the ground. Go and have a beer with someone when you can, who doesn't share the same ethnic background as you. And then who knows, that might lead you to wealth and riches as well. Certainly more than it will have done for me sitting here being an academic.
Yeah, reach out to people around you, but know that you know that they are under a lot of pressure, especially Chinese students. If they're still in Canberra, they must be under tremendous pressure. So be understanding, reach out to them, and help each other, and be kind to each other, because we're just all, you know, we're all just humans. We're all individuals, and we should just all be nice to each other.
Oh, wouldn't it be nice if we could all just be nice?
Yeah. And I think it's definitely very good advice to have a beer with someone that you know.
Or tea.
Or you, oh yeah,
Yeah.
sorry, or this if you're really
Yeah,
into
by
the hard
June.
stuff. Like, this has been sitting on my shelf since about 2005. I don't mind a drink, and I'll probably have a glass of wine after this because it's now 5 o'clock, which is when my grandmother said it was okay to have a drink. But it is not going to be Wuliangjiu because that is not something that I can quite get my stomach around. But if you can, go for it, you know. And I just love having that bottle there. The only bottle in my liquor cabinet that never disappears. It's just always there, the same. I was given it with that much in it. So anyway, go and have some fun.
That's really great. So yeah, so again, a huge thank you for speaking today. And I want to extend that thank you to everyone in attendance, especially for the riveting questions that we had, and you know, quite active commentary in our chat box.
Yeah, it was great.
It was a really great session. Thank you everyone for coming, and looking forward to future events with you guys in the future.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Bye everyone.